Do you feel like these young emerging writers have that capacity, or have they developed the skill to observe their world, which you got painfully through your anthropological training?
So I asked a very general question, which is on the one hand also quite anthropological. Where are you from? How do you feel about that? You know, sort of where do you belong? Where are you from? Where do you belong? And how do you feel about that? It has certain elements in it of home, of belonging, of feelings. But then I also asked them, you know, in your description, you need to imagine an audience.
Michael, you've been doing a workshop with our creative writing students where you've been trying to teach them about the value of lucidity in words and the sharpness in ideas. And it's probably been an interesting 3 days for you and the students. So I thought we could start by asking you about your journey experimenting with non-academic writing, the creative non-fiction. And while I was thinking about the question, I was also wondering if this distinction of creative that we associate with non-academic writing of fiction and non-fiction, is this not fundamentally a great distinction? Is there place for, let's say, creativity or epiphany or ways of experimenting with form even in academic writing? So maybe you could start off by telling us how you sort of experimented with both kinds of forms probably.
Yeah, so I think, it's an excellent question, and it kind of really speaks to both my own personal journey and also what I just shared with the students. Me doing my PhD in anthropology, my master's in anthropology, I wasn't always into the social sciences. I actually started doing a bachelor degree in international management, and for a few years I worked in IBM. So in many ways I come from a very pragmatic background in terms of studies and what that needed to result into, which was a management job. With a big company, and then I realized that it wasn't for me, and I started studying anthropology because I always had a huge interest in the world and in literature, and in anthropology I really felt that these two things came together. Obviously when you're a student you write papers, and when you're doing a PhD that turns then to conference papers, which eventually need to become papers that are being published in edited volumes in academic journals. And for the longest time, that's what I did. But I did also realize I would always write for school papers, and I wrote a lot. I shared a lot of my writing also online. But I never quite thought of it as, and that relates to what you just asked, like what space is there in academia to do that? For the longest time, I didn't quite consider doing that because, as a young academic, we need to publish. And so you need to build up your resume, and there's no real time for thinking otherwise. Or at least we tell ourselves that we cannot do that. It was only after a while that I realized that all the time that went into my academic publishing wasn't necessarily making me feel fulfilled as an academic and as an intellectual. I always find that a really weird term to use for myself, but especially because the audience is very small and very insular in academia. Academic papers within the field of social sciences get read by an average of 7 people. And obviously, the papers that do get read, because some papers don't get read at all, and I'm sure some of mine are among that, is tip of the iceberg. So, the tip of the iceberg are the papers we include in what we use for teaching, for our students, are the ones that our colleagues talk about. And there's an enormous amount of writing which goes through endless review processes. It takes very long to get your stuff out. It starts with 2 years, as we all know, from the moment you start putting pen to paper to when it's out. At some point, getting a bit more senior in my career, I thought, is this really the only way that I can channel my energy and my thinking and what I want to say. And also partly it was opportunistic to a degree. Like, I like having an audience. You know, I like there being some applause. I like it when people come up to me and say, I've read a piece of you and it really moved me, or it really did something for me, or it really illuminated something that I hadn't thought of before. And in many ways, I was disappointed also that I wasn't getting more of that in academia. So it was also about me. I'm not not hesitating saying that. But at the same time, that didn't come with the idea that I was suddenly becoming, you know, a Nobel Prize winning author or something. I mean, it wasn't about winning a Booker Prize. It was more about, I want to share my ideas with a wider audience, and I want to have that discussion with a wider audience. And it didn't really seem to be happening for me with academic texts, and that led me to, at some point, decide to do my next book in the field of nonfiction.
It's interesting. So, you know, other than the fact that you wanted to sort of have a bigger audience, there are also choices of form, like how will I write it now, differently from the academic space. I was thinking that, you know, you are an urban anthropologist, and you very closely look at the city and its inhabitants. And the other day I was sharing with you this thought that you could even think of a writer also in many ways as an anthropologist, especially the writer who writes about the city. And both for the anthropologist and for the writer, as in the writer of fiction, it's the city which is almost the biggest character to deal with in your books and in your writings, right? So to stay on this question of form, like how did the city and its inhabitants and its problems and so on come alive for you in this non-fictional or non-academic form in a way? Was there a transition or...
Yeah, so in my last book, I still remember that moment very well when I decided to write that book. It was on a flyover in Chennai, and I'd just come back from an interview. So I was stationed in Chennai at the time to do research on the migration industry. So I'm at my core, perhaps a migration scholar. A lot of my writing has been about migration. And I was, with that specific reason, I was in Chennai and I was doing a research for the Asia Research Institute in Singapore. And our question really related to, why do migrant workers pay so much to go and work in Singapore? So this was one research I was doing, but for the longest time I had been following the trajectories of lower middle class men who work as fitness trainers and who participate in bodybuilding competitions. And that was, I realized it was a project that started when I was living and working for Nalanda University in Delhi. And I realized that it was something that was gestating very slowly over time, but it was deeply embedded in the question of the city itself. Because these were men who were working in a very specific profession and doing a very specific thing with their bodies. But they were from vernacular lower middle class backgrounds. They were new middle class, and they were also highly upwardly mobile. That was their ambition, but they were struggling a lot with that. And that's what the research started out with. Now, fast forwarding that moment on that flyover in Chennai, this was after an interview with a migration agent, very different topic. And I was walking across the flyover thinking I was going to go and walk back home. It was very hot. No one in its right mind should be doing that. But I had always done that because I realized that these walks were good for me as an anthropologist to pick up on where my interview had taken place. So that was a small office, an air-conditioned office in a nondescript, somewhat run-down office building, not at all like the IT industry is inhabiting in Chennai or in Bangalore. And that was the journey I was mapping out. And I found myself on that flyover, and I was looking out at Chennai, and it occurred to me how the city itself was also, again, rapidly changing, how there was change around me everywhere. And every year or multiple years, I would, multiple times per year, I would come back to India. And that's what always occurred to me when I drove from the airport to home. in Bangalore or from the airport to a hotel, wherever I was in India. So the speed with which everything was transforming hit me quite hard on that desolate flyover in the burning sun, covered in dust, probably thinking like, I shouldn't be doing this in the first place. But I've done weird things that way. And I thought this notion of transformation stuck with me. And I thought, what is it with transformation that is striking a chord here? And I thought, this is what the men I've been following around for all these years, working on their bodies, are also doing. And this is where their bodies also fit in. As their bodies are transforming, the cities are transforming, their lives are transforming. And that transformation itself all runs parallel, but at different speeds. But they speak to each other. They, for some reason, that's maybe my anthropological training, that I think like, all these things have something to do with each other. And then I thought, this could be an academic paper. And then I thought, not another academic paper. I think this is a book. But then I also thought, this is not an academic book. I want to share this particular observation on the flyover, being sweaty, being uncomfortable, being out of place.
Put yourself also into that book somehow.
Yeah, channel that into a book and describe these journeys also as they are. And I think what brought me also with nonfiction in that way was two different things. One was I wanted an audience to discuss this with, and I wanted that audience to be Indian, not transnational and academic. Because I also thought, I want to know if I'm right about this. Like, did I, and if I write that down and if people read my work, will they then say, no, you're right, or you made me, after all these years of studying this topic, because in the end I'm a foreigner, I'm a white European from the Netherlands. So, is my insight valid? That was the one thing. The other thing was also that I realized if I do this at nonfiction, I can actually write down all these stories in my way, instead of having to buttress it between layers of theory. Because invariably that's what you'll end up doing, because this was about bodies. So in anthropology, when it's about bodies, it's about gender. When it's about gender, it's about sexuality. So that means you'll have to do things with Pierre Bourdieu and Foucault, and you'll have to say things about Baudrillard and, the big French thinkers, which I wasn't really in the mood for, because it was also a feeling of there we go again, like how long? But I do feel they can exist side by side. So a lot of the chapters in the book eventually did become academic publications, which I neatly layered with a compulsory theoretical angle.
But it has all the flavors of the stories.
Yeah, but I'm glad I did the book that way.
Right.
Yeah.
So you've been interacting with these young people over the last 3 days, and also maybe in other places you've taught in the past, maybe not specifically creative writing. Do you feel like these young emerging writers have that capacity, or have they developed the skill to observe their world, which you got painfully through your anthropological training? So without going through that trajectory, do you feel like they already have it, or is there a way in which writing programs can teach it to them? Is it possible, or is it something which comes with life?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the way we started with this particular short course, which is an intensive 3-day course, was really about talking about yourself. So I asked a very general question, which is on the one hand also quite anthropological. Where are you from? How do you feel about that? Sort of where do you belong? Where are you from? Where do you belong? And how do you feel about that? It has certain elements in it of home, of belonging, of feelings. But then I also asked them, in your description, you need to imagine an audience. Your readers need to understand that. And that works two ways. It isn't just that you need to explain certain things about you. You need to lay bare certain things, maybe certain things that may feel uncomfortable sharing with the world. You need to find a way in that. But it also is sometimes about making people part of your world, is excavating what makes that specific. Certain smells emanating from the kitchen because your mother was making filter coffee, or your father coming home and putting on certain type of music, because he was very much into the Goldie oldie Bollywood songs of the 1950s, or stuff you grew up with that another person doesn't know. So one of the things we also tried to do in writing was writing it down and then bringing in elements that might keep the reader entertained, following your story through. And a lot of that is anthropology, but it's anthropology of the self, right? It's, you know, you need to reflect on your life from an outsider's perspective. So, you know, that means not taking for granted that if you're born and brought up in Coimbatore, Tamil Nadu, and you're now studying in Bangalore, that everybody understands what Coimbatore is all about, or when the cook comes in the morning and makes a certain breakfast for your father because he won't be eating anything else. So it's all these little things, you know, layering a text but with tidbits that make the social and the cultural come alive.
Right. And it's therefore also looking again at things that are so familiar that you otherwise don't really observe them.
Yeah.
But when you start observing them, they all come alive again.
Yeah.
You know, in a way, you know, as we talk about young writers and cities, we are now made aware of these new phenomena that is happening in Indian cities called the literature festivals.
Yeah.
So if you look at, you know, in the last one decade, every major city of India has a literature festival.
Yeah.
And Alliance University also has experimented with its own version in the imagination that university is also an extension of the city and the ideas in the city. There should be a dynamic give and take. You've been associated with the last literary festival that Alliance just finished in February as its curator. You know, I was wondering whether these new literary festivals, how they reflect or how they're part of what we could call the socio-cultural churn in India today.
Yeah.
And I ask it from these two prisms. One is this idea of the middle class that you've been interested in, right?
Yeah.
Are these literature festivals still largely about the upper middle class? Or, you know, are they open-ended at the borders, and can they have, you know, other kinds of, as you say very much in your book, that, you know, middle class is exactly not a defined category. It's always open at the borders. People can keep coming in. You talk about the question of mobility. Do the literature festivals that we have now been acquainted with, do they make possibilities of that on the one hand? And on the other, if we take, let's say, these Indian English, Indian languages and literatures and Indian languages, when they come in, do they also make space for dialogue between, let's say, the English-speaking urban middle class and, you know, the other, you know, middle class, which probably has grown upon other ethos?
Yeah.
So what do you feel like? Is there...
Well, I think the first thing, I mean, what came out of the Muscular India project, which I conducted over roughly a decade, following young men as they make their way up the middle class ladder, is the realization how crucial English is in all this. Not necessarily as a language to communicate in, but what functions as a threshold and a gatekeeper, because the upper middle classes send their kids to convent schools or English medium schools in which that comes natural. And for the people I interviewed and followed, that doesn't come natural. So they realize that from early on, if they want to climb the middle class ladder, it's not just about economics, it's also partly about all that social and cultural capital. And that's still very much something that happens in English. And you see that reflected in the major literature festivals in India. Are all festivals that cater to an English-speaking audience. And that was the same here with the curation I did. I was very particular on, because I feel one of the most exciting waves right now in Indian fiction is what comes from Kannada, Malayalam, Tamil, Telugu, Bengali, Hindi, and it's all fabulously translated, much better than it was in the past. So there's much more attention to that. There is also a much bigger expectation from publishers like Penguin and HarperCollins that these books will do well in the market. But obviously, in the end, they need to be accessible in English because otherwise nobody else is going to read them. And you see that a little bit in that Tamil fiction is rarely translated into Hindi. So if you, from the Hindi belt, will access Tamil fiction, you'll be doing that in English. So that thing isn't necessarily happening very well yet. It is happening a little bit, also in other unexpected languages, like my native language is Dutch. And we've had some fiction from Hindi being translated in Dutch and the other way around. But these are even more niche areas with limited print. One thing I see with, for instance, Jaipur Literature Festival, which is of course by far the biggest one in India, has always tried to include vernacular language sessions. They're well attended, but they always exist at the periphery. This is not to blame JLF, at least they're doing it. I think here at Alliance, we didn't do it. But maybe that's something we could consider next time, where at least we put the spotlight on Kannada writing, which is right now going through an enormous development. And I could only familiarize myself with that writing and enjoy it in English because I have no reading skills in Kannada. But it certainly could be there. And if you look at where this university is located so close to the Tamil Nadu border, and you look at the student body, if I just look at the student body we just now had at the course, it's a very mixed group of students. I mean, they're native Malayalam speakers, Dakni, Hindi, Bengali. There is a lot in one class. So surely it will be of interest, but it's partly also marketing. But I think that development is there now, especially because writers like Perumal Murugan, Vijay James, others are really winning awards, are really coming into their own. I know that Perumal Murugan right now is in London at a literature fair, where he's garnering a lot of praise and attention. So, that literature, obviously there's a lot of pride in it. And I do know that if you would create a pure Tamil session with Perumal and you have him interviewed to that would resonate with students because in the end, that's what the language is that it was written on. And I think one thing we did really well with this festival is where we at least talked a lot about the meaning of translations and how we find an audience and how the audience speaks to it. Like we had a couple of really wonderful writers from Japan. And Japanese fiction is so popular in India right now. Like you walk into Church Street and you see all these piles of these books and you think like, how is this resonating with an audience? But it also, we had Ginny Tapley Takamori here, who's a very famous translator, who's done some of the biggest Japanese authors, and it's such a fascinating thing to engage with, right? Like these questions like, what decisions does she make? Knowing the readership that she'll be catering to with this translation, and how does it speak to the author, and how is the author involved? And if I may continue on that, these are big themes because the other day I was speaking separately of the festival. I was having coffee with Vijay James, who's his work is now very well translated. And we were talking also about how does he relate to his translation work. And he said, no, indeed, it doesn't always work out as you hoped because, obviously you can read the English translation and sometimes he thinks like, no, this is not how I have intended my Malayalam to speak to an audience. And I think that's so fascinating because, at the same time, at one of the sessions where Vasudendra was also there, the Kannada writer, and I think one or two other writers, and they were talking, the interviewer was also talking about, do you ever think about the audience? And do you ever think about how this will come across in English? And all of them said, absolutely not. When I write in Kannada, I write in Kannada. For a Kannada audience, that's where the language comes alive. The translation is the second place. But so coming back to your earlier question, whether or not you can open up a literature festival to a bigger audience, I think in the end, we need to be honest about this. Literature itself always has class connotations and has expectations of level of education. But if you look, for instance, at the work of Vasudendra, in his initial Kannada writing, he was immensely popular among a very large Kannadiga audience that we wouldn't necessarily, still is. So, so that requires also, if you want to do that as part of the curation, then you also need to turn to the writers themselves and say, how do we do that? And work with, where there's a lot of vernacular literature being published these days is online through tools like Pratilipti. Yeah. And they have huge readerships, and I'm sure their audience wants to get to know their authors, but that means that we also need to think beyond books with a cover published by Penguin and HarperCollins. And
of course, these indicate immense possibilities for the future, especially for young and upcoming writers.
Yeah.
And it constantly points to something the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said, that you cannot grow up simply on a single story in the globalizing world, and in a world like India, which is inherently so diverse.
Yeah.
So, you have to just, even if you don't understand a language, you should be able to go and sit in a vernacular session and see what is the ethos, what's the kind of questions that come out of there. So, we hopefully we can experiment with more of this in the future.
Yeah, I think maybe on the side, sorry I'm interrupting you, but I was thinking of something else that I really felt worked well at the recent Alliance Literature Festival, is that we treated a lot of other formats also as text. Documentaries, music, film, graphic novels, photography, where you say, well, all of that are communicating a story and are speaking in a certain way. And I think that this is something literature festivals in that sense can do more, kind of bring in interesting performers, bring it alive. A lot of singers have text to share that is deeply poetic, and says really crucial things about life. And then you kind of also show that literature isn't that different from lyrics or from, artistic representation in another way. So, yeah.
In fact, I constantly tell my students that, a 21st century writer cannot write without the knowledge of films, for instance. You've grown up to the idea of the image, that when you try to capture a scene in a book, you're really thinking about how the image plays out.
Yeah.
So in a way, all these many texts come into play when you're actually experimenting with writing. And that, sort of also brings me to this next question, the area of interest that you have between AI and art. We can't escape discussions today about literature or art or creativity without referring to AI. And you have seen the, sort of two ends of the spectrum. The set of people who say that no, AI can't replace humans because, faculties like, which are specifically human faculties like emotions and empathy cannot be captured by AI. On the other hand, there is then, the doomsday feeling that, AI is replacing all human creativity in some ways. I was wondering if in this we can actually pose a interesting historical and philosophical question about creativity itself. That is it pushing us to think about creativity? Is it a product of a collective, or is it a product of an individual genius? To share an experience with you, an anecdote from one of my classrooms in the introduction to literature classrooms that we do here, I always say, if you look at the earliest forms like the epics, nobody quite really spends so much time wondering who the author was and what their background was, who's Homer, or who's Valmiki, the Indian epic writers, or the Epic of Gilgamesh, who authored it. Nobody quite cares. But from from at least the Renaissance in the Western culture, the idea that it's the author, the individual genius, you can't talk about a Shakespearean play without actually talking about Shakespeare and the time and so on. I was wondering if now AI is actually forcing us to confront that a little bit and say that, genius is not located in the A person, but it's a product of many things that are there in your culture, in your background. So I wonder if you have any thoughts in this.
Yeah, I'm of course immediately thinking about what we did last year when we had the Confest here on campus, and then so I curated this exhibition at BIC, where we took some of these art installations by young emerging artists from India who work with AI in a creative way. And one thing that I thought made these artworks so interesting is that they, on the one hand, show you the potential for AI to be utilized in creative fashion, and on the other hand, these artists also show that through that creative engagement, you can also interrogate AI and learn more of its functioning. And sort of when I was with the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, where I did most of the work that I did on AI the last few years, I formulated my research question around the idea of how do we now live, create, and work with this technology. So, and in doing so, I wanted to treat it as another species. Now, I'm not saying that it's a plant or a dog, but it is something we live with and we share the planet with, and it is a reality as such. And too often, coming back on what you said in the beginning about, you know, the fear for AI, the apocalyptic AI, I've in my writing and my thinking, I've tried to deshackle that a little bit from these connotations of the apocalyptic and the dystopic, instead suggesting that where we fear AI, we often build upon a social-cultural archive, as I call it, of past representations of AI in the media. And coming back what you said, like the image is so crucial in that. So many movies revolve around that. Whether it's Hollywood or Bollywood, there is so much fear associated with AI, which makes for an interesting plot line. But that is not the AI we're dealing with now. And I think the dangerous thing lies more in the fact that we don't question enough how we live with this technology and also how we could contribute to its functioning. Almost everything we do generates data in life. I once suggested in a paper that I wrote that as we exhale, we also exude data. In almost everything we do, we generate data that goes into data centers. That also makes AI a specific thing to live with in planetary terms, because it's already using about 1.5% of global electricity. It's massively draining on planetary resources. So it is very much something that, you know, is rooted in our oil, in our soil. If you think about, for instance, Bangalore, we've all been complaining how warm it's been recently. Climate change really is impacting the city. There's no denying it. And IT industry uses a lot of electricity, a lot of cooling water. So all of it is connected one way or the other, and that is a reality. We don't need to be activistic about that and start shouting that the world is going under. I find that inherently unproductive. In the end, it is also about realizing, like, okay, where does the energy go? And it's the same with data. We produce AI. AI doesn't produce us. But there is a certain cyclical relationship where certain of our own biases and stereotypes feeds into data, contributes to the layering of AI. And the way that AI is then misappropriated for all sorts of purposes creates a feedback loop in which a lot of these feelings are elevated, made bigger. So I think it all starts with realizing better how our own data footprint, how our own preferences, biases, clicks and likes all contribute to how AI functions. And then in the end also contributes to certain media outputs, certain outputs in terms of, you know, illustrations of all that. So we're all connected to that. But I also understand that that's a very conceptual shift that we need to go through as a society.
No, I'm surprised by the fact that, many of the things we are saying brings back the anthropological as a metaphor in the, sense of how we relate to the new technologies of the last 1 century, whether it's filmmaking or now AI. And a writer has to live with, okay, with the idea that how do I deal with all these things? How does it come into my story? How do I borrow from it or contribute to it, and so on? And that's a much more productive relationship than saying, oh, I will either be a naysayer and not use it at all, which is not possible.
I mean,
or,
fear of technology and developments and changes of all ages, the idea of doom,
is very old. It's probably as old as technology itself.
permeated religions from the start. The apocalypse, the end is nigh. Some savior presenting itself, or some mythological character heralding in the end of times, whether it's the Kali Yuga or how the Christians define that, or the Azrael's flaming sword, or however way you want to put it. That's of all ages, but it also has a tendency of making us a little blind for what we're dealing with on the spot. And one thing I see as an anthropologist, meandering about, like I made long walks. I'm weird that way, so I love walking also in India. So I'll make these long walks, and whether it's across Chennai or Mumbai or whatever, visiting the outskirts of cities. In Mumbai, I traveled up to Ulhasnagar to see what the end of Mumbai looks like. In Delhi, I would do that, going all the way to the outskirts of Noida and Gurugram, and seeing how the cities change and develop. It has always occurred to me that I think it's interesting how we're fearful of an apocalypse and doom, but our population has only grown. In the time that I've been coming to Bangalore for some 23 years, the population of this city has grown from 5 to 15 million. The city started when I came here for the first time. It was the 6th largest city in India. It's now the 3rd largest city in India. There were not yet 1 billion Indians. There are now 1.4 billion Indians. If you look at planet Earth and its population, then that doom is not really translating yet in declining numbers. It's translating it into something else, where one of the biggest questions, one of the biggest elephants in the room, is how we're all going to make it happen together with such large numbers. And I think you feel that pretty much in an Indian city, but you feel that everywhere, also in the Netherlands. I mean, born and brought up in the Netherlands is one of the most densely populated countries in the world. And there are people everywhere, and everybody wants something.
Surprisingly, something you say of India.
Huh?
I said that's surprisingly something you say of India, that there are people everywhere.
Yeah, there are people everywhere, but there are people everywhere in Netherlands, and they all have their wishes. And surprisingly, these wishes don't always keep pace with the developments in keeping the planet safe. So if you look at the per capita imprint of a Dutch person on the environment, it's much larger than an Indian person. But obviously, when there's only 18 million people, you can't really compare that in the end with 1.4 billion. But that is still the same planet that we inhabit and that we share with AI now. So, like the Netherlands lives under seawater, right? I mean, most of the Netherlands is located some 2 to 3 meters under sea level. So, if the dikes break, we're goners. The Netherlands is certainly not going to last much longer than islands in the South Pacific. A lot of the developments are planetary and have to do with all of us, with us being and wanting to be with billions, wanting to protect. We always feel a sense of loss when we hear of a big war or a big accident. We think, oh my God, 45 people have died. That's always a sense of mourning. In the same way, we mourn the environment. We mourn the dying out of species, of animals and plants, which is directly related to all of our behavior. And I think it starts with removing guilt and blame from that equation, and to own up with how that works. And I think anthropology has a role to play there, but writing also, and coming back to the group of students that we had in the room now, that writing is laying bare where future lives are heading, because they are inheriting this planet from us, and they'll inhabit it beyond me. So my immediate concern is also how they're I want to provide them to a certain extent with some of the tools, at least, to handle this the way my parents were already preparing me for change and doom by giving me the tools to handle that. So, yeah.
So on that beautiful thought, I think we can, thank you for being with us, and thank you for this conversation. And it's a wonderful thought you've left us with, in a way that a writer today, or any young person indeed, I mean anybody for that matter, can really think of AI as another species, also as a form of technology, but also another species in a way that you are dealing with. And the more interesting question to ask is, how do you live with it? How do you transform it? How do you shape it? And in turn, be willing to be shaped by it.
Yeah, I think that's always my question, is how we continue living together. And in doing so, we need to face the reality that we now live with AI too. But that's for the future to sort out. And that's also why we, have universities full of young people, because, they'll be shouldering that burden.
Michael, thank you so very much for this conversation. It was lovely. And we hope to have you here in the future very soon. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.